Hi guys, welcome back for lesson 99. So today we're going to look at fraction, decimal, and percent equivalents. So this is actually just a review. Y'all have learned this stuff before, so this is just going to be short and sweet. I'm just going to go through it. We're going to review the concepts and look at how you put it all together in the chart. So we'll just get started. So they start out by giving us a fraction of 1/2 and asking us to find the decimal and the percent version of that fraction. So this is actually one that you guys already know. So we really aren't going to spend time going over how to find the percent, because you know that 1/2 is always, percent's always 100 as total, right? So half of that would have to be 50%. And I know you guys are already familiar with that. So let's review real quick though how we would get from 50% to its decimal equivalent. So if we've got a percent of 50%, to turn it into a decimal, so to go from percent to decimal, you always just want to bump the decimal 2 places to the left, okay? We've looked at other ways of doing this, but this is how we're going to do it for today when we're trying to just kind of get through a whole bunch of different representations. So if we're going from percent to decimal, that means bump the decimal 2 spaces to the left, okay? So you're like, what decimal, Miss Gutierrez? I don't see a decimal. Good point. The decimal, if we don't see it, remember, is always at the very end of the number, okay? So we can just plop it right there at the end. That's where it will always be if we don't see a decimal given. So then we can just take that decimal, we can bump it 2 spaces to the left, and so then we just rewrite that, which would look like this. Now, this 0 here at the end is actually not necessary, because if you have a 0 that is after the decimal at the end, you can actually remove it, because 50, if you look at this, this would read as 50 hundredths, right? Or if we got rid of the 0, it would read 5 tenths. Well, those are actually equivalent. So 50 hundredths is the same thing as 5 tenths. So we can write it as 5 tenths, and that is the same value. Okay, so we're gonna write our decimal as 0.5 or 5 tenths, and that would technically be simplest form. So if you have a 0 left on the end like that, I want you to take it off. After the decimal is the important part, okay? If we're talking about the actual number 50, you can't just get rid of that 0, because that makes it 5, and that's not equivalent, okay? But if we're talking about decimal 50, that is the same thing as decimal 5, okay? I hope the fractions kind of help you see that. Okay, so let's look at C. So now in this row, we're given a decimal of 0.3. So let me just do a little erasing here. Okay, so if we've got a decimal of 0.3, we can also read that, kind of like I just referenced with the last one, we can read that using place value as 3 tenths. Well, just like that, just by reading it the way that it sounds using place value, you've turned it into a fraction. So to go from decimal to fraction, you just write it like you say it. Remember, that's the rule we always said for those, using place value. So write it like you say it, using place value. Okay? Awesome. So we're getting close. So that's our fraction, and we always want to check to see if we can simplify that or reduce it. But we know that 3 and 10 do not have any common factors, so we're good. I'm throwing markers. We're good. So we'll just leave it as 3 tenths, okay? Then we've got our decimal of 0.3. So just like we said, going from percent to decimal was bumping the decimal 2 places to the left. When we're going from decimal to percent, we're doing the reverse. So you guessed it, decimal to percent. We are gonna bump that decimal. Let me just create a little barrier here. We are gonna take that decimal and we are gonna bump it 2 spaces to the right this time. So what happens when we have this empty space with no number in it? That's right, filler 0. So we plug that filler 0 in there, which would make it 30%. And again, that was done by bumping the decimal 2 spaces to the right. Awesome. So then that's 30%, almost done. We got one more row to finish out here. So let's take a look at this bottom row. They give us a percent of 40%. So we've already talked about turning the percent into a decimal. So 40%, we know to turn into a decimal. Remember, if that decimal isn't there, it's always at the end. So we can bump it 2 spaces to the left, which would be written as 0.40. But remember, we said that 0 at the end, if it's after the decimal and there's a 0 on the very end, can go bye-bye. So that would just make it 0.4, okay? Which 0.4 can also be read as 4/10. Now, when we converted a decimal into a fraction by reading it using place value last time, we didn't have to do any simplifying because 3/10 cannot be reduced. But this time, we noticed that 4/10, 4 and 10 both have a common factor of 2. Remember, that means they can both be evenly divided by 2. So I'm going to divide each of those by 2 in order to simplify. So 4 divided by 2 gives me 2. 10 divided by 2 gives me 5. There's nothing else I can do to reduce that. So that's going to be my fraction. And that's it. So go ahead and work on this homework. And you guys are 2/3 of the way done this week. You got one more lesson and then you're golden. So keep it up. Happy homework. Bye, guys.